Welcome to episode 8 of Awakening the Ordinary. My name is Daniel Clower, and this week I want to have a discussion with you. See, I am by my nature a conservative. That's just who I am. In the past, I have voted Republican before. And so while I have been extremely outspoken about some of my disagreements with the Trump administration, I want you to know that it's not coming from a place of hatred. I don't hate Republicans. I'm not excessively liberal, although I do have some liberal ideals. And so that's why in some ways I'm considering myself more and more moderate or a centrist. When the next Democratic president comes into power, I can guarantee you that I will absolutely be making video after video, criticizing some of their decisions, talking about the legality of some of the things they're trying to do, and letting you know my thoughts on it. So in this video, I wanted to bring up some of the talking points that I hear very regularly in my comment section and just in everyday conversations that I have with conservative people. I want to talk to you as a fellow conservative, and I want to explain to you why I have some serious issues with what the Trump administration is doing. So I really hope you'll give me a shot. I hope you'll listen through and pay attention to some of the arguments I'm making. I'm going to be splitting this video up basically into two parts. The first part of this video, I'm going to be listing 7 different issues that I'm having with what the Trump administration is currently doing. And I'm going to be talking about their legality, logical issues that they have. It's not going to be very opinionated. I'm going to try and base everything that I talk about in cold, hard facts, because I understand that's what a lot of you want to hear. You don't want to hear about moralizing. You don't want to hear about the ethics. You don't want to hear about, boo-hoo, I think it's wrong. You want to hear about whether or not it's legal. I respect that. So for the first part of the video, that's what I'm going to talk about. After that first part, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Scroll down and let me know what you think. If you agree, if you disagree, you can discuss amongst yourselves as well. I just have 2 specific requests for you. The first is, I want you to be respectful to your fellow commenters, because that's really the only way you can have any kind of meaningful, engaging debate. If you go and act like a jerk to somebody, they're not going to want to talk to you, and they're definitely not going to take your point of view seriously. So first things first, just please be respectful. And remember that you're talking to a human being on the other side of the screen. The second thing is, I really want you to keep it on topic, because almost every single video I make, inevitably somebody will say, well, but Joe Biden, or but Kamala Harris would have been worse, or but what about this other immigration case that you're not talking about? And it's just a little tiring, I guess. It's whataboutism. It's basically trying to bring up other fringe cases or unrelated cases to kind of undermine the point that I'm making. But that's not who I'm talking about right now. If I made this YouTube channel when Joe Biden was president, I absolutely would have been making videos about things that Joe Biden was doing. But I didn't. I made this YouTube channel right now when Donald Trump is president. And so I'm talking about things that Donald Trump is doing. So please just try and keep it on topic. Try and talk about the things that I am mentioning in this video specifically. If you do want me to make videos about other topics, other things that are going on, other current events, I'm happy to. Let me know. You can shoot me a message. You can reach out on Discord, and I am more than interested in hearing what you want me to make a video about. But if I didn't mention it in this video, please, let's just stay on topic. Now, I mentioned that that's what the first part of the video is going to be. The second part of the video, I am actually going to be diving into the ethics and morality of what's going on. I have a Christian background, and my faith is very important to me. So I'm going to be talking about things from a somewhat religious perspective. I've got a couple of Bible verses that I have in mind that I think pretty strongly go against some of the things that the Trump administration is doing. And so I think that's important, and I want to share that perspective as well. Now, the final thing that I'm going to be doing in this video at the very, very end is I'm actually going to be reading a direct response from the U.S. Fourth Circuit Appeals Court. They just came out with a ruling today, and it is, frankly, one of the best written rulings I have seen. I found it really moving. And so at the very end of the video, I'm going to be reading it out loud in its entirety to you. So if you're interested, Take a look at the timestamps below. You can skip all the stuff you're not interested in and listen just to that if you want to hear what's in it, but don't want to bother reading it for yourself. And seriously, I would really recommend checking it out, either listening to me read it at the end of the video or checking it out from one of the links that I'm going to be posting below that has the text in its entirety. Let's go ahead and begin. The first topic that I want to bring up, and again, these are all based on comments that I get really regularly or conversations that I've had with people, is that foreigners in general and non-citizens are not afforded constitutional rights because they're not citizens. So I want to break that down for you a little bit. First of all, there is significant precedent in the Supreme Court that that's not the case. Anybody who is in the United States is entitled to certain constitutional rights. Now, obviously, you're not entitled to every single constitutional right if you're here visiting or here illegally. I mean, you can't vote, for example. You can't just, take a vacation to the U.S. On November 5th and drop your ballot in the box, but you still do have certain inalienable rights. So some of the court cases I would recommend you take a look at are Wong Wing versus the United States, Yik Wo versus Hopkins, and Bridges versus Wixon. These are some of the cases that I found in my research that really show kind of exactly what the Supreme Court has in mind, and by extension, really what the founders had in mind when they wrote the Constitution and talked about the rights that people have. Actually, I want to drop a specific quote here by Antonin Scalia. He is a Supreme Court justice. He's basically kind of a deity in the conservative realm. He said, and I quote, "I think anybody who's present in the United States has protections under the United States Constitution." So the Constitution repeatedly mentions that persons have these rights. So it doesn't say that only citizens have these rights. It doesn't say that only, people who are here legally or people who are registered or anything like that. It says persons. So when you talk about the constitutional rights like the 14th Amendment that grants due process, that applies to all persons that are within the United States at this time. And again, this is extremely common precedent. The Supreme Court has never ruled in the opposite direction, that the Constitution just simply doesn't apply to people that are not citizens. The second comment that I get very regularly is actually pretty related. So this relates more to the deportation case that we've got ongoing now. It's where we sent over 200 Venezuelan men to El Salvador, and especially one gentleman named Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He's making a lot of headlines recently because of the specifics of his case. So this comment is, Kilmar Abrego Garcia and the others are criminals and non-citizens, so they don't get due process, and or it's okay that we ignore due process for them, even if they're supposed to get it. So rather than relying on that Supreme Court precedent, which, like I said, I mentioned with the last point, I want to make more of a logical case for you here. If you don't grant due process to every single person, how can you know for sure that you are only not granting due process to criminals or to people that are here illegally? For example, this Thursday of this week, a US-born American citizen was detained in Florida by ICE, probably because he didn't speak English very well. He's ethnically Mayan. So they pulled him over, they detained him, and even though he showed that he had a legitimate birth certificate that was reviewed by a judge, he was still held for hours and hours afterwards. He was not given due process because they thought he was a criminal, or maybe he had a tattoo that matched up with some known gang affiliation tattoos. We would not have known that he was actually a U.S. citizen, and he could have theoretically been sent on one of these secret planes to El Salvador. If you don't get your day in court, if you don't get an opportunity to at least present evidence in front of a judge, if not actually stand in front of a jury of your peers, then there's no way that you can speak up for yourself. There's no way you could ever prove that you're not a criminal. So at that point, it goes simply on the judgment of whoever arrested you at the time. Okay, the next thing that I keep hearing consistently, and I think this is Stephen Miller's fault, to be honest, and I'm going to talk about him a little later, is that specifically for Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the withholding of removal order that a judge gave him is not legally binding because he's a terrorist. You will frequently hear that two judges have found that he is a member of MS-13, which is an international gang and has also been declared a terrorist organization. That's not really accurate. All the court documents are available online. You can see them. I'm going to post links to them below as well, so you'll see them in the description. And that goes for anything I reference. What the judges actually found was that there was not evidence that he definitively was not an MS-13 gang member. One thing you have to keep in mind is that immigration courts are not criminal courts. They have a different set of rules. They have a different set of requirements for evidence. So here's the evidence that was presented, and this is to show that Kilmar is a member of MS-13. I'm going to read it directly. The police, when they picked him up from the Home Depot parking lot, found that he was wearing a Chicago Bulls hat and a hoodie with rolls of money covering the eyes, ears, and mouth of the presidents on the separate denominations. And what they said was MS-13 gang members are only allowed to hang around other members or prospects of the gang. When they picked him up, he was with three other men. One of them was definitely not an MS-13 gang member. Two of them might have been. So they're using the fact that he was basically standing around some other MS-13 gang members as evidence that he was also part of the gang. And the fact that he was wearing a Chicago Bulls hat as well as a hoodie with rolls of money covering the eyes, ears, and mouth of presidents. What they said was, according to the report, police contacted a past proven and reliable source of information who advised that Abrego Garcia was an active MS-13 member in New York City, a location that he has factually never lived. Again, I'm kind of trying to avoid opinion too much in this first part, but I do think that's a very, very large stretch to say that that conclusively proves that he's an MS-13 gang member. I mean, we don't even know exactly what the informant said about him other than he is a gang member. They gave his like gang nickname and his supposed rank in the gang, but we don't know if that means he saw him performing gang activities or he heard it from another person that he considered was reliable. I mean, we really have no idea. But again, like I mentioned, immigration courts, they have different rules. So they don't have like hearsay rules like you would have in a criminal case. So essentially the only evidence at all that they have is that an informant said he was a member. And then the other thing that you see frequently about this withholding of removal stay, I guess you could call it, is that he got a withholding of removal order because he's in a rival gang. This is also entirely inaccurate, and I'm actually not even sure where they get that idea. I mean, the court document from his immigration case spelled it out pretty clearly. It gave a really detailed background on exactly who he is, why he left, and why we can't send him back. And it was not because he was found to be in a rival gang at all. It was because he was in danger from a gang that did work in the town that he lived, but it never said that he was a member of a rival gang at all. And again, I'm going to blame Stephen Miller for all of this, and I'll explain more later, but just know that if somebody is telling you that he was in a rival gang, that is not conclusive. There was no evidence. There was no court document saying that he was. The United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth put it in these terms. The government asserts that Abrego Garcia is a terrorist and a member of MS-13. Perhaps, but perhaps not. Regardless, he is still entitled to due process. If the government is confident of its position, it should be assured that position will prevail in proceedings to terminate the withholding of removal order. See Section 8, subsection 208.24F, requiring that the government prove by a preponderance of evidence that the alien is no longer entitled to withholding of removal. So basically what they're saying is, if he's a member of MS-13, okay, just prove it. Just prove it in the court of law. That's all you have to do. And then you'll get the withholding of removal order taken away and you're good to go. You can send him on his merry way. I want to go ahead and handle this next comment that I get a lot. It's that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Trump administration unanimously, and also that facilitating is meaningfully different than effectuating. So again, I want to thank Stephen Miller for this, and again, I'm going to be talking about that more later. But for now, because I just want to be purely factual, I don't want to inject any opinion or anything like that, I just want to read to you directly what the Supreme Court said. So this is a direct quote. I'll kind of discuss it as I read it, interpret the legalese for you, but here's what they said. The United States acknowledges that Abrego Garcia was subject to a withholding order forbidding his removal to El Salvador, and that the removal to El Salvador was therefore illegal. The United States represents that the removal to El Salvador was the result of an administrative error. The U.S. is admitting we made a mistake. There was an order that would have and should have prevented us from sending him. We accidentally sent him anyway. Point blank. That's what the U.S. is legally admitting. That's what they told the Supreme Court. Here's this next part. The application is granted in part and denied in part, subject to the direction of this order. Due to the administrative stay issued by the Chief Justice, the deadline imposed by the District Court has now passed. To that extent, the government's emergency application is effectively granted in part, and the deadline in the challenged order is no longer effective. What that's saying is basically they asked us to put a stop to this. We're sort of doing that to the extent that it took us a little bit to come up with this judgment, and now the previous deadlines have passed. You guys win. Congratulations. The rest of the district court's order remains in effect, but requires clarification on remand. The order properly requires the government to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador and to ensure that his case is handled as it would have been had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. The intended scope of the term effectuate in the district court's order is, however, unclear and may exceed the district court's authority. The district court should clarify its directive with due regard for the deference owed to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign affairs. For its part, the government should be prepared to share what it can concerning the steps it has taken and the prospect of further steps. Pause here for a second. So that essentially means that they're saying the initial ruling was correct. The U.S. government does absolutely need to facilitate Abrego Garcia's return from El Salvador. The only issue they have is that term effectuate. So they said basically, that's fine. They need to facilitate and effectuate the return. Okay, but you have to really be specific with what you mean by effectuate, because the judicial branch is not allowed to decide foreign policy. And foreign policy does involve things like essentially hostage negotiation. So Abrego Garcia, you can almost think of him as being held hostage by the El Salvadorian government. Now, it's a little different because Trump really doesn't want him back. So it's not exactly a hostage situation, but that's a good way to think about it. Because the U.S. courts cannot order the president to essentially march on El Salvador and militarily evacuate Abrego Garcia. Like that would be essentially starting a war. And obviously the courts cannot order us to do that. That would be far overreaching their boundaries. So instead, what this is saying is you need to tell us exactly what you mean by effectuate. So obviously you can't tell us we have to go march the military in and get him, but what are you saying we have to do? I think it's pretty clear that the Supreme Court did not rule in the Trump administration's favor unanimously. In fact, it was the opposite. They ruled unanimously in favor of the district court. So here's what the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals had to say about this. The Supreme Court's decision does not, however, allow the government to do essentially nothing. It requires the government to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador and to ensure that his case is handled as it would have been had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. Facilitate is an active verb. It requires that steps be taken, as the Supreme Court has made perfectly clear. So basically what they're saying is you can't just do nothing and say we're all out of ideas. You have to do something. You have to actively try in some way to get him back. You can't just say, well, if he's returned, then, it's fine. Like that's good enough. It doesn't just mean you have to allow a plane be sent there if he does somehow get out. It means you have to actually attempt to facilitate the return. And again, this is not my opinion. This is the opinion of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. Okay, so issue number 5. It's okay if President Trump sends U.S. citizens to El Salvador because they're bad people and they shouldn't have broken the law. This one is a little complicated legally because there is essentially no precedent for this sort of thing ever happening. But I did do a ton of research for this particular thing because it was so unprecedented and so strange. I really wanted to get to the bottom of what does the actual law say. I have my own personal opinion. I'll tell you about that later, but I wanted to know what the actual law said about whether or not this was legal, constitutional, etc., etc. The closest thing that I could get to a legitimate legal opinion is that this definitely would violate habeas corpus, which means it's Latin for produce the body. It basically means you have to be able to physically be retrieved, physically, be able to show up in court. And especially in particular, you have to be able to physically be immediately released if so ordered. So in this case, if you were in El Salvador, obviously you could not be produced at a moment's notice. You could not just be taken and brought into court to appear before a jury of your peers. You couldn't really be immediately released either because you would be on foreign soil and you can't just be dumped out on foreign soil. That would be literally deporting you. So that was the closest I got to an actual firmly legal argument on whether or not this was legal or illegal. Now, I did see that a bunch of legal scholars chimed in, and they had a lot of different opinions. I mean, they all basically said it would be unconstitutional and we could definitely never do this. But for specifically why, they had some different opinions. Some of them said that it could violate the Fifth Amendment because it could get in the way of due process. It could violate the Eighth Amendment because it could be considered cruel and unusual punishment, especially because if we sent them away to other countries that didn't necessarily have the same standards of prison facilities, it could mean that you are, for example, sleeping on the dirt, or you don't get to shower, or maybe they engage in corporal punishment that we don't allow, or things like that. And it would be really hard for us to essentially have oversight over that. We couldn't really verify that if we send it to another country. And it could possibly also violate the 14th Amendment for equal protections under the law, and that's basically for similar reasons. We wouldn't really know necessarily what they're exactly doing in the prison, and so we couldn't absolutely verify that these constitutional rights wouldn't be violated. Again, that one's a little more complicated, and I'll kind of get into it a little more when I do the second part of this video where I talk about more of the ethics and morality about it, but that's where I stand for now as far as the legal opinion. Next comment I see a lot, but the idea is generally the same. It's that regardless of legality, if the administration is doing something that I support, it just doesn't bother me. Or if it's President Trump doing it, it doesn't bother me because I really like Trump. Or if it's the Republican Party getting behind it, then it doesn't bother me because I'm a Republican. For this one, it's not so much that I'm going to just cite legal precedent because obviously if you're saying I'm going to support something even if it's illegal, then there's no legal argument to make. It's illegal. That's it. I want to make the obvious logical refutation here, which is basically that if this administration can supersede the law, if this administration can essentially make a mockery of the judicial branch, then that means that later administrations will also be able to. So down the line, when you get a Democrat becoming president, and it will happen eventually, I mean, it just will, they're going to be able to supersede the law and overreach just as much as President Trump has. And there's really going to be no argument against it because you let the last guy do it. If you don't want a Democrat to be able to overreach And I know a lot of you guys are concerned about, for example, the Second Amendment being violated. President Trump can violate the 14th Amendment or the First Amendment. Well, guess what? Whatever Democrat president comes up next, Gavin Newsom or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or whoever, they can violate the Second Amendment. They can take your guns. So I think it's just important to have a little foresight, basically. Everything that happens now can happen in reverse. So just be wary. The other thing that I want to point out is that this isn't really conservatism. This isn't really what the Republican Party is like supposed to be about. I kind of mentioned it briefly at the very beginning, how in the past I voted for Republicans and I consider myself relatively conservative. But the MAGA movement, that's not conservative. Conservatism is about small government. It's about free markets. Right now, what we're doing is the opposite of that. You're jailing dissent. You're imposing tariffs. I mean, that is quite literally the opposite of what small government is supposed to be. And I guess this is kind of verging on more opinion-based stuff, but logically speaking, if you are a conservative, I really don't see how you can support Trump wholeheartedly, because whatever he is, he's clearly not truly conservative. I know the term rhino gets thrown around a lot, Republican in name only. And that basically is supposed to mean that you don't actually have Republican ideals, you just use the Republican label because it's convenient for you. And to be honest, there is no more obvious case of that than Donald Trump. Finally, I want to talk to you about this last argument that I hear. And this one is really not so much going to have like an opinion or an emotional appeal or whatever, because it's just pretty much straight up factual. It's about the tariffs. And I see this comment every single time I talk about the tariffs. It's that Trump is playing 5D chess, and that these tariffs aren't going to be permanent, and we're actually going to use them to negotiate much better trade deals on behalf of the US government. Legally speaking, there's really not a ton to talk about. There's not really legal precedent or Supreme Court rulings or anything like that. Essentially speaking, the legislative branch, so Congress, is supposed to be the ones who enact tariffs. It's not really supposed to be the president coming out with a big, beautiful board and showing everybody what the reciprocal tariffs are going to be. The Republicans and Chuck Schumer basically signed away that right in the last continuing resolution. So thanks, Chuck. So there's nothing like legally questionable about it, sort of. But there are definitely some logical arguments I want to make here. First of all, there are two massive exporters in the global market. There's the United States and there's China. China is our biggest economic rival. They are probably the country that is most dangerous to us, potentially. The country that's most kind of antithetical to our quote unquote American ideals. And right now, we are raising trade barriers with every single country in the world. And I know we did pause reciprocal tariffs temporarily, but we are apparently not going to be pausing the flat 10% tariff that we're giving to everybody, no matter what. And a lot of these reciprocal tariffs are going to be coming back after the 90 days if we haven't come to a deal by then. And apparently negotiations are relatively slow right now. But again, we are raising these economic barriers with other countries. So if we are raising barriers, basically by definition going to be pushing every country to have a stronger trade relationship with China, which is going to weaken the United States' global standing. We don't want people buying from China. They're going to be raking it in and get filthy rich because we decided to raise these trade barriers, essentially for no reason. We didn't have to raise these trade barriers. There was no pressing need. There's no emergency. There's no reason. Trump's reciprocal trade tariff plan, it's not reciprocal at all. It's basically based on a formula that takes into account the amount that we are importing, meaning bringing in from other countries, versus the amount that we are exporting, meaning sending to other countries. So it's basically, if we are buying more from them than they are buying from us, we are implementing tariffs on them. I think, first of all, it shouldn't come as a surprise to you that the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world is more of a buyer than a seller. I mean, we're obviously going to be doing a lot more buying than we are of selling because we have a lot more money. But I don't just want to talk in vague terms. Let me give you a very practical, real example. Vanuatu is a country in Oceania. It's a series of about 80 islands. In 2023, their GDP, which is essentially how rich they are, how much money they have as a country, was about $1.1 billion. And that ranked 184th out of 196 countries. So very much so towards the bottom. They are one of the poorest countries in the world. On President Trump's big, beautiful reciprocal tariff board, he showed that we are planning on charging them a 22% tariff. That's pretty significant. Now, the way we got to that number is because they exported a fairly large amount of fish to us. And when I say fairly large, it was in the millions of dollars worth of fish. So honestly, an absolute minuscule drop in the bucket compared to our normal amount of imports. But for a very small and poor country like Vanuatu, that's a big deal. Now, what do you imagine a very small and poor country might want to import, meaning buy, from the United States? Well, the thing that we most exported to them was oil, gasoline, and airplane parts. Now, I want to emphasize here, this is a country that has a population of about 320,000 people. That's a little less than the population of Orlando, Florida. So we bought a lot more from this very, very small country that only has about as many people as Orlando, Florida has, than they bought from us, which I think makes a lot of sense logically. They don't have money to buy expensive things from us or to buy many things from us. They don't need many things from us. And so, because they sold us a bunch of fish, we are punishing them by throwing a tariff on all of their goods. I think that doesn't make any sense at all. And this is a story that gets repeated time and time again. Choose your country. Colombia sells us coffee. We can't grow coffee here. Well, they sold us a bunch of coffee and now we're punishing them by implementing tariffs against them. That just doesn't make any economic sense. It makes zero logical sense. And again, conservatism is typically about free trade. This is the opposite of that. This is enacting a bunch of tariff barriers. So that is the end of my logical appeal. That is the end of my discussing law and precedent. I want to go ahead and run back through these issues, and this time I'm going to be approaching it from, yes, a somewhat logical view, but really more so I want to focus on the morality and the ethics of these decisions. So again, if you don't want to hear that, that's totally fine. Check out the timestamps below. I'm going to have a link there to the very end where I read this ruling from the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. That is really awesome. Otherwise, I genuinely, sincerely look forward to hearing from you below. I would love to hear your opinion. I would love to get a dialogue going, not just between you and me, but really the whole comment section. I would love people to kind of come together and start discussing what they have in common and where they can find common ground. So let's rewind back to the very top, and I want to talk about this first issue. Foreigners in general and non-citizens are not afforded constitutional rights because they're not citizens. Again, just disregarding like actual law, the Constitution, yada, yada, yada. These rights were called inalienable rights by the founding fathers. They called them that because they believed that the Constitution did not actually confer any rights on anybody. The Constitution did not grant these rights. It didn't give anybody these rights. These are rights that everybody is born with. They are God-given. Nobody can take them away. And the Constitution basically just describes them. They're rights that you can never have taken from you. The right to due process, the right to speak freely. These are rights that are God-given. They're inalienable. Nobody can ever take those rights away from you. When you talk about whether or not rights apply to persons, keep in mind that the founding fathers thought they apply to absolutely everybody who's a person. And just personally speaking, do you really want to take something as basic as a human right away from somebody, from a fellow human? I'm not talking about trying to give these people anything extra. I'm not talking about trying to give them handouts, give them money, give them anything. I'm talking about this inalienable thing that they already have just by being a human. Do you want to rob them of that? Second of all, Kilmar Abrego Garcia and others are criminals and non-citizens, so they don't get due process, and or it's okay that we ignore due process for them, even if they are supposed to get it. I already kind of talked about inalienable rights, and all of that absolutely applies to this as well, but I want to bring 2 points to mind. These people, typically speaking, are coming here from countries where English is not their first language. They're usually coming from desperately poor situations. In the case of Kilmar, he was literally, as a child, fleeing for his life. They might not speak English at all. They are frequently confused and scared. So saying that these people who are only coming here, typically speaking, to escape absolute destitute poverty or genuine danger, shouldn't be afforded a process that is due to every single person, it's heartless. And it's not just me saying that. I told you before, I come from a Christian background, and the Bible talks about this, and it doesn't vaguely talk about it in a way that you can kind of interpret it how you want. It talks specifically about this. It's actually in Leviticus in the Old Testament. It's Leviticus 19:34. God said, "The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God." God says, when you have people who are from another country, you don't treat them differently. You don't treat them like they're not the same as you just because they passed through some invisible border. God says, you're not from where you are either. God says, I brought you out of Egypt where you were foreigners. God says, every single person is a child of God, and they are no different than you. So you treat them with love, and you treat them with compassion, and you treat them as your own countrymen. But Jesus talked about this too. Jesus said that these types of people were actually the people that we needed to take care of most. And he explained that, I think, most succinctly in the parables of the sheep and the goats. And this is from Matthew chapter 25. It's verse 34 through 40. He said, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?' The king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" Jesus was abundantly clear that you are not supposed to turn these people away. You are not supposed to scorn them or spurn them. You are certainly not supposed to celebrate it. We are called to take care of those in need. And again, I'm not even talking about the politics here. I'm talking about Jesus Christ and what he called us all to do. So if in any way you take this whole Jesus thing seriously, and you are right now celebrating these men being kidnapped and put on these secret planes to El Salvador, I think you really, really need to take a look in the mirror and spend some serious time in prayer, because there is no way, biblically speaking, to justify this behavior. Next thing I want to talk about is this, the comment specifically for Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the idea that his withholding of removal order is not legally binding since he is a terrorist. Okay, so this one, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more with the next note as well, but when he came here as a literal child. I mean, he was a teenager, and he was fleeing danger. He was scared, alone. I can't imagine his English was fantastic since he was so young coming here. I see a lot of people asking, why didn't he apply for asylum earlier? Or why didn't he follow the correct steps? Why didn't he do the immigration process the right way? He was a kid. And I just want to ask you sincerely, like, when you were 16 years old, did you know that you have to apply for asylum in the United States within 1 year of entering illegally, or else it's not a valid application? I mean, honestly, did you know that before I told you just now? If the answer is no, then I think maybe you might want to reconsider the fact that this guy is a horrible terrorist and he should be sent away because he didn't ask for asylum in the right amount of time. But actually, I want to get into this real quick right afterwards because it's very much related. It's this note that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Trump administration and that facilitating is different than effectuating. Okay, so this is where I get to rant about Stephen Miller for a little bit because that dude is a slimy liar. I mean, genuinely, he is a slug in human skin. And he got up in front of people, and here's what he said. This is a direct quote. He said this to the President of the United States in front of the press corps. The Supreme Court said the district court order was unlawful, and its main components were unlawful and reversed 9-0 unanimously. Okay, I read to you the Supreme Court order earlier. If you recall, they specifically said, no, the lower courts were absolutely correct, and you do have to facilitate his return. And they can even use the word effectuate, by the way. They just have to clarify exactly what they mean by that. And somehow, Stephen Miller had the gall to go up in front of the press corps and say that. So I will let you decide if you think that the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 unanimously against the Trump administration or not. But I'm telling you, I read you direct quotes saying they did. Stephen Miller is a grifter. Stephen Miller has somehow wriggled his way into the administration and now holds infinitely more power than somebody with his low of a moral character should ever hold. He cannot physically stop lying every single time he opens his mouth. He will happily go up and tell you the exact opposite of the truth. If he told me that the sky was blue, I would do a double take. He is the maybe single most untrustworthy person I have ever had the absolute displeasure of seeing in my life. And every time I see his smarmy little face lying and prevaricating on screen and people eating it up somehow, it makes me genuinely nauseous. I am sick to my stomach every time I hear his voice. The other thing that Stephen Miller said is that this wasn't a mistake. This was totally intentional, and anybody who says it was a mistake is a provocateur in the DOJ, some kind of inside job, a secret Democrat saying these horrible lies. And by the way, if Kilmar was ever sent back to the United States, the Supreme Court has ruled that we can send him back right away. Again, not a single part of that is true. It's completely false. Every aspect of that. The Supreme Court order said that the United States admitted this was a mistake and that they knew it was illegal because it was a mistake, because they knew they should not have actually sent this guy to El Salvador. And of course, if he gets brought back to the United States, God willing, he will not be immediately deported again, like Stephen Miller says. But that brings me to my next point, which is if the administration is admitting that they made a mistake, which they were doing for many, many, many days until Stephen Miller got up in front of everybody and said they weren't, why wouldn't they try and make it right? Why not at least make some kind of good faith effort to put it right? They said it was a mistake. If you make a mistake, don't you try and fix it? Even if you don't think you can, don't you at least say sorry? But they're not. They're parading around like the cock of the walk. They're extremely proud of their mistake, which tells me, frankly, they're pretty bad people. You don't make a horrific mistake like that and then rub people's face in it. That's wrong. It's just wrong. I like to think that every single person watching this video, if you made a truly egregious mistake, so egregious that literally the Supreme Court writes an opinion saying, yeah, you guys messed up real bad. You might at least say sorry, right? You might at least ask, hey, can you send him back or just let him out and we'll come get him? I mean, we're paying El Salvador like $6 million. I think we can use that as a little bit of leverage, right? But no, we're not trying to make it right at all. I mean, it's really horrific. It's like, again, this is why I saved this for the moral section, but like, they're just bad people. They really are. They're just bad people. Speaking of bad people, the next argument is that it's okay if Trump sends U.S. citizens to El Salvador because they're bad people. They shouldn't have broken the law. So for that, I guess I actually could have even put this in the legal section or the logical section, but the truth is that the government makes mistakes like pretty frequently. I mean, this whole Kilmar Abrego case is a mistake. It never should have happened. They accidentally did it. So if they accidentally sent somebody they shouldn't have already, literally the very first time they tried sending people to El Salvador to this prison camp, why wouldn't it happen again? And not to mention, like, people are wrongly convicted fairly regularly. It's not unheard of that people are wrongly convicted and then years later we find out, whoops, we made a mistake. Oops, gotta let them out. Not to mention, they have now said, and I think they're lying, to be honest, but they have now said that they can't just get people back whenever they want. They said they don't have jurisdiction because it's not American soil. So why would you take that risk where you wrongly convict somebody, you send them to El Salvador, and now, whoopsie daisy, you just can't get them back? Oops, that's supposed to be okay? If there's even a 1% chance of that happening, then that's far, far too much. If there's a 0.1% chance of that happening, that's far too much. You cannot just willingly deport United States citizens. You can't do that. And now think about the fact that let's say you do send people to prison in El Salvador, and let's say they're guilty. That means they will never, ever be able to get visits from their family. They'll never be able to see their parents, their spouse, their kids, ever. They likely won't receive letters. They will be completely isolated and alone. And I understand they did bad things. Okay, I think everybody has done a bad thing at one point or another. If you are watching this video and you have never done something that could potentially be illegal, if you have never gone over the speed limit, then first of all, I commend you. And second of all, I think you're lying. Because the truth is we all make mistakes sometimes. And yes, what these guys did frequently was not just a mistake. It was something really horrific and bad. But that doesn't mean that it's okay to act horrific and bad in return. We have to hold our government to a higher standard. And if you can't understand that you should do that just because it's the right thing to do, then maybe you can understand that you should do that because one day the government might be turned on you. And speaking of the government might be turned on you, the next issue is that regardless of legality, if the administration is doing something that I support, it doesn't bother me. Or because I'm a Republican, it doesn't bother me. I already kind of mentioned and went into how Republicans and especially particularly Donald Trump are not really truly conservatives anymore. I mean, there is nothing about Donald Trump that is really conservative. MAGA is not about following any kind of political ideology. It has zero internal consistency. It's about tribalism. So I don't know how you can honestly, truly say that you support everything that MAGA is about, because MAGA doesn't even know what MAGA is about until Donald Trump opens his mouth and tells them what to think. It's a cult of personality. It's about following the whims and desires of one Donald Trump, even if that completely contradicts what he said a month ago or a week ago or 10 minutes ago. You want to feel like you're part of this group, this team, this tribe. You want to stick it to the liberals because, frankly, the liberals do a bunch of dumb stuff and in many cases may have tried to make you feel bad for who you are. And so now you want to give it back to them. You want to hit them right back where it hurts. But that's not the way to form an ideology. You cannot base your ideology around just being a hater. You can't base your ideology around just wanting to hurt people's feelings. Because Trump has taken over the Republican Party, anybody who's against Donald Trump is now labeled as a crazy liberal, as somebody having Trump derangement syndrome, as being a secret Democrat or a rhino. I mentioned this before, but during the Obama administration, I would have been considered probably extremely conservative. By all rights, I I still arguably should be. My ideals have not really changed that much. But now the right has abandoned its own ideals. The Republican Party, conservatives have abandoned everything that they used to represent, and now they only represent the whims of Donald Trump. And what used to be the party that cared most about limiting government overreach, about preserving the Constitution, is now celebrating while Donald Trump stomps all over it. There is absolutely nothing wrong with being a conservative. There's nothing wrong with being a Republican. But I have a lot of issues with people that are MAGA first, and I hope that I have spelled them out for you in this video. Before I get started on my reading of the Fourth Circuit's Court of Appeals ruling, I just want to thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate you opening your mind, opening your heart, and I really hope that this leads to some good, positive discussion. Because at the end of the day, I genuinely, truly, and maybe naively believe we have more in common than what keeps us apart. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you soon. Upon review of the government's motion, the court denies the motion for an emergency stay pending appeal and for a writ of mandamus. The relief the government is requesting is both extraordinary and premature. While we fully respect the executive's robust assertion of its Article 2 powers, we shall not micromanage the efforts of a fine district judge attempting to implement the Supreme Court's recent decision. It is difficult in some cases to get to the very heart of the matter, but in this case, it is not hard at all. The government is asserting a right to stash away residents of this country in foreign prisons without the semblance of due process that is the foundation of our constitutional order. Further, it claims, in essence, that because it has rid itself of custody, that there is nothing that can be done. This should be shocking, not only to judges, but to the intuitive sense of liberty that Americans far removed from courthouses still hold dear. The government asserts that Abrego Garcia is a terrorist and a member of MS-13. Perhaps, but perhaps not. Regardless, he is still entitled to due process. If the government is confident of its position, it should be assured that position will prevail in proceedings to terminate the withholding of removal order. Moreover, the government has conceded that Abrego Garcia was wrongly or mistakenly deported. Why then should it not make what was wrong right? The Supreme Court's decision remains, as always, our guidepost. That decision rightly requires the lower federal courts to give due regard for the deference owed to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign affairs. That would allow sensitive diplomatic negotiations to be removed from the public view. It would recognize as well that the facilitation of Abrego Garcia's return leaves the executive branch with options in the execution to which the courts, in accordance with the Supreme Court's decision, should extend a genuine deference. That decision struck a balance that does not permit lower courts to leave Article 2 by the wayside. The Supreme Court's decision does not, however, allow the government to do essentially nothing. It requires the government to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador to ensure that his case is handled as it would have been had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. Facilitate is an active verb. It requires that steps be taken, as the Supreme Court has made perfectly clear. And I quote, "The government should be prepared to share what it can concerning the steps it has taken and the prospect of further steps. The plain and active meaning of the word cannot be diluted by its constriction, as the government would have it, to a narrow term of art. We are not bound in this context by a definition crafted by an administrative agency and contained in a mere policy directive. Thus, the government's argument that all it must do is remove any domestic barriers to Abrego Garcia's return is not well taken in light of the Supreme Court's command that the government facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador. Facilitation does not permit the admittedly erroneous deportation of an individual to the one country's prisons that the withholding order forbids, and further, to do so in disregard of a court order that the government not so subtly spurns. Facilitation does not sanction the abrogation of habeas corpus through the transfer of custody to foreign detention centers in the manner attempted here. Allowing all this would facilitate foreign detention more than it would domestic return. It would reduce the rule of law to lawlessness and tarnish the very values for which Americans of diverse views and persuasions have always stood. The government is obviously frustrated and displeased with the rulings of the court. Let one thing be clear. Court rulings are not above criticism. Criticism keeps us on our toes and helps us do a better job. Court rulings can overstep, and they can further intrude upon the prerogatives of other branches. Courts thus speak with the knowledge of their imperfections, but also with a sense that they instill a fidelity to law that would be sorely missed in their absence. Quote, "Energy in the executive is much to be respected," written in Federalist No. 70 by Alexander Hamilton. It can rescue government from its lassitude and recalibrate imbalances too long left unexamined. The knowledge that executive energy is a perishable quality understandably breeds impatience with the courts. Courts, in turn, are frequently attuned to caution and are often uneasy with the executive branch's breakneck pace. And the differences do not end there. The executive is inherently focused upon ends, the judiciary much more so upon means. Ends are bestowed on the executive by electoral outcomes. Means are entrusted to all of government, but most especially to the judiciary by the Constitution itself. The executive possesses enormous powers to prosecute and to deport, but with powers come restraints. If today the executive claims the right to deport without due process and in disregard of court orders, what assurance will there be tomorrow that it will not deport American citizens and then disclaim responsibility to bring them home? And what assurance shall there be that the executive will not train its broad discretionary powers upon its political enemies? The threat, even if not the actuality, would always be present, and the executive's obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed would lose its meaning. Today, both the United States and El Salvadoran governments disclaim any authority and/or responsibility to return Abrego Garcia. We are told that neither government has the power to act. The result will be to leave matters generally and Abrego Garcia specifically in an interminable limbo without recourse to law of any sort. The basic differences between the branches mandate a serious effort at mutual respect. The respect that courts must accord the executive must be reciprocated by the executive's respect for the courts. Too often today, this has not been the case. As calls for impeachment of judges for decisions the executive disfavors and exhortations to disregard court orders sadly illustrate. It is in this atmosphere that we are reminded of President Eisenhower's sage example. Putting his personal opinions aside, President Eisenhower honored his inescapable duty to enforce the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education II to desegregate schools with all deliberate speed. This great man expressed his unflagging belief that the very basis of our individual rights and freedoms is the certainty that the president and the executive branch of government will support and ensure the carrying out of the decision of the federal courts. Indeed, in our late executive's own words, unless the president did so, anarchy would result. Now the branches come too close to grinding irrevocably against one another in a conflict that promises to diminish both. This is a losing proposition all around. The judiciary will lose much from the constant intimations of its illegitimacy, to which by dint of custom and detachment we can only sparingly reply. The executive will lose much from a public perception of its lawlessness, and all of its attendant contagions. The executive may succeed for a time in weakening the courts, but over time, history will script the tragic gap between what was and all that might have been, and law, in time, will sign its epitaph. It is, as we have noted, all too possible to see in this case an incipient crisis, but it may present an opportunity as well. We yet cling to the hope that it is not naive to believe our good brethren in the executive branch perceive the rule of law as vital to the American ethos. This case presents their unique chance to vindicate that value and to summon the best that is within us while there is still time. In sum, and for the reasons foregoing, we deny the motion for the stay pending appeal and the writ of mandamus in this case. It is so ordered.